So hello and welcome to everybody. This is the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author webinar on performance of maritime logistics. I'm Ronan Mackerlane from the International Transport Forum's communication team, and I'm joined today by the report authors Antonella Theodoro from MDS Transmodal and Olaf Merk, ITF's ports and shipping expert. So we'll be looking at the performance of containerized maritime transport since 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, and looking at the changes and trying to explain those over a 10-minute presentation from Olaf, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. You can already give us your questions from now by using the Q&A function. It should be in the bottom of your Zoom windows. So if you send us your questions already now, we can start to have those ready and get our answers ready for you after the presentation. So the report was launched last week. It's already had huge interest, over 700 downloads on the web, and a lot of media interests from the top outlets, including Lloyd's List, the Lodestar, Splash 247, etc. So without further ado, I'll give the floor over to Olaf Merk from the International Transport Forum for a presentation followed by your questions.
Thank you very much, Ronan, and thanks so much to all of you for your interest in this new ITF report that we did indeed together with Antonella Theodoro from MDS Transmodal. What is the report about? Well, basically, it wants to give an overview of the performance of containerized shipping over the last years, look into what have been the causes and the effects of those indicators of performance. We have analyzed some of the impacts on trade flows, on modal shifts, on vertical integration, and we have assessed what are main policy implications of what has happened over the last 2 years. And we end this report, we conclude with some policy recommendations to policymakers. So these are 5 points that I'll try to cover fairly quickly in the next minutes in a few slides. I'll start with performance. Performance, essentially, when it comes to price, the reliability, speed, and direct liner connectivity. What we have seen is that the price has gone up spectacularly over the last, the price of containerized transport over the last two years. It's both the case for spot rates, so for, let's say, the last minute container bookings, but also for contract rates. Over the same period, the reliability of container shipping went down. So we're now in a situation where 2/3 of the container ships arrive with a delay of more than 1 day. And this is much worse than it was a few years ago. When it comes to the speed and the transit time of containerized transport, we have seen several developments, including longer handling time in ports. That is particularly the case in ports in the US, where this time has gone up with 100%, so it doubled. It is much less the case in Europe, where we saw an increase in the handling time of 15%. And another performance indicator that we think is relevant to take into account is the direct liner connectivity. So the number of connections that ports have with other ports, and so the possibility for shippers to get their cargo out directly to a lot of other countries, which declined in most world regions, in particularly in Latin America, Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So how can this performance be explained? Well, there have been several explanations that have been circulated and been discussed. One of them is related to a different balance in demand and supply. The idea here is that there have been periods of economic lockdowns in which it was much more difficult to buy stuff in shops, but that this also led to some sort of an explosion of demand when people were free again to shop, but also when it comes to e-commerce, that of course was still possible. So the idea of an unexpected explosion of demand that was related to lockdowns and also the stimulus packages of different countries that could explain why suddenly there was a lot more demand for containerized transport. When you look at this explanation, you see that this holds for some regions, for the US in particular, but not for most other world regions where the demand for containerized transport and for manufactured goods was more or less stable. So there was some sort of a, let's say, a catch-up, but this was only a short period and not very significant in most regions, with the exception of the US. Another possible explanation of this situation is port congestion. I already mentioned that there are differences between different regions. We saw that there was quite a lot of port congestion in the US, in China, less in others, but it's also important to see what has been the sequence of it. And we saw that in some parts of the world, ships started to be much less reliable actually before the ports started to be congested. So there is a relation between the two, but we think that in some cases the deteriorating ship reliability has actually maybe contributed to port congestion. And finally, there's another possible explanation, which is related to the capacity management of shipping companies. And this is what we have seen during some of the economic lockdowns when there was less capacity. A lot of the shipping capacity was withdrawn from the market, was idled. And it took a while before that capacity was brought back in the market. And we think there is a link with the freight rate development, and in the later stages of this whole COVID crisis, we've seen a lot of capacity repositioning from different trade lanes to other trade lanes, which could also have an impact, of course, on the scarcity and on the rates for those trade lanes. So a lot of different causes and effects that are possible. We think that the demand and supply balance can only explain it to a limited extent. The same for port congestion, and we think that also the explanation of the capacity management by shipping companies. What were some of the impacts? Well, we looked at trade patterns and we found that some industries have actually seen changes in those. For example, there were less exports in 2021 of textiles from Asia to Europe, so more near sourcing. But overall, the tendency is not really that spectacular yet, maybe. There's also been impacts on modal shifts, particularly in 2021, where we saw a large increase in the Asia-Europe containerized rail traffic. So it's suggested that some of the ocean traffic went actually maybe shifted to rail in that year. Of course, it's more difficult to say for 2022 due to the war in Ukraine that has, of course, disrupted this tendency. And another impact that we have looked at is the vertical integration of container shipping companies. So that is container carriers that invest in logistics companies, terminals, forwarders, e-commerce, and even in aviation. And this has been, of course, made possible by the huge profits that a lot of the top 10 carriers have made during the COVID crisis. Now, what are the policy implications of all that? I mentioned the particular situation of the US, and what we think that this crisis in a way illustrates is that some of the local supply chain problems have spilled over to other regions than the US. So there was a demand explosion in the US, there was port congestion in the US, and in a way, these problems have now spilled over to many other regions and have created worldwide problems. So the current global supply chain situation. That, of course, has been made possible by the fact that there are globally integrated networks. And you could say these have, in a way, undermined resilience and buffers that could have isolated, could have stopped some of these spillover effects. It is also a situation and has been facilitated by public policies that have, well, facilitated the consolidation of the container shipping industry, and have also made it possible for them to work together in consortia and alliances, and that has made it possible for carriers to do practice joint capacity management. A point to be made here is also that actions by one regulator can have consequences for jurisdictions that are actually somewhere else. So in this case, for example, the Chinese regulator has asked carriers at some point to put more capacity on the Transpacific route. And of course, this has also meant that there was less capacity on the Asia-Europe route. And that made, of course, capacity there scarcer. And that, of course, has also translated in rate increases on that route. Let's say the bottom line of that story is there are global liner networks that are more and more integrated, but there are actually no global regulations when it comes to competition or coordination between different authorities. And that brings me to the last slide, which is about policy recommendations. There are actually quite a few recommendations on competition. The first is to improve the monitoring of competition in container shipping. So more monitoring, more cross-border cooperation between different agencies in this field. Second recommendation is related, that is to reconsider the competition arrangements for liner shipping, and to really have a look and reconsider if what is currently in place is still the best arrangement. Part of that, and that's the third recommendation, is to focus more attention on fair competition in door-to-door container transport. So as I said, there's more and more vertical integration, but we wonder if regulatory frameworks are actually ready for that. Then there's also recommendations to increase the transparency of the container shipping rates and the different charges, including the merchant detention charges. There's recommendations to collect more performance information on the containerized transport chain so that it will actually be better possible to monitor what is going on. Better secure the strategic value of container shipping by policymakers. And the final recommendation is to charge users of public maritime infrastructure more than is currently the case to increase the cost coverage of those infrastructures. So these are our main recommendations. I think this is also where I will stop. I will thank you for your attention, and of course, Antonella and I are more than happy to answer any questions you'd have on this report.
Thank you very much indeed, Olaf, for that very succinct summary of a very concentrated report. So without further ado, let's get into our panel, our subscribers' questions. A reminder that you can use the Q&A function to send in your questions. So already from Kurt Rai-Damkier, that you mentioned vertical integration. Kurt's question is, how much of this vertical integration do you think comes from the fact that shipping lines in question receive major indirect state support, including programs like tonnage tax schemes? And you might also, Olaf, expand on why vertical integration is necessarily problematic.
Yes, good questions. Vertical integration. Well, as I mentioned, vertical integration is let's say the phenomenon where a lot of the shipping companies are now becoming active in also other parts of the maritime logistics chain. So, for example, in terminals, in logistics companies, in freight forwarding, and also now in air cargo. On the positive side, you could say if there is more integrated network, that could also mean a smooth, smooth interfaces between, let's say, the different parts. So that could be the positive side of vertical integration. The negative side could be that there is actually less choice for shippers, and also that there is a risk of using the dominant position in one market to force customers in another market. So, for example, shipping companies might impose on their clients also a certain port choice or a terminal choice, or might impose certain logistics services that they offer themselves. And that is maybe a particular problem when shipping related privileges will be used in these different markets. I think that is also what the question is referring to. Shipping companies, and particularly also container shipping companies, have different sorts of privileges or special treatment in regulation. So, for example, in taxation, that is indeed the tonnage tax in many countries. That is the taxation of a shipping company on a much more favorable rate than the regular corporate income tax rate. But there's also privileges when it comes to the exemptions from the regular competition law frameworks, etc. So, of course, this is problematic if the shipping company is going to use the same privileges also in the other parts of the supply chain, because that means that there is going to be distortions of competition, as there will be, let's say, different companies that are not shipping companies, that don't have these privileges, but that will be offering freight forwarding services, or terminal services, or whatever, and that don't have these advantages. So that is why we recommend to have a better focus of regulators also on these risks and trying to avoid these.
Thanks indeed, Olaf. There are at least two questions in about ship reliability from Emmanuel Bears and Matteo Craglia. First of all, what do you mean by ship reliability? Is it linked to technical issues with vessels? And can you expand on the potential worsening of reliability and why it might have changed significantly above previous levels? Either Olaf or Antonella for that one.
Sure, I can start, and Antonella can add if she complement if she wants. What we mean here by reliability is the reliability of shipping services, and indeed I could have been clear on this. So this means that there is an announced service, and is the ship actually respecting the service that has been announced, and the scheduled arrival time in a particular port. So we simply use here the indicator that's been proposed by Sea Intelligence, which is a maritime consultancy company, and in their definition, ship is still reliable. So still according to schedule if it arrives in the announced port with a margin of +1 or -1 days. If it is taking more time to actually arrive in that port, then it is considered to be not reliable, or not according to the schedule. And that is the data point that I was giving. So at this point, 2/3 of the ships arrive with a delay of more than 1 day, compared to the time that was announced, that was scheduled for that ship in a particular port. Antonella, I'm not sure if you want to add something there.
Yes, please. Thanks, Olaf. Yes, one thing that we have done to complement what we can look at the service reliability. So when basically if and how distance is the time the service arrived compared to the scheduled time of arriving, is assessing the impact that not arriving in time is having on ports and how much capacity is de facto subtracted from the usage of shippers. This doesn't mean necessarily that the capacity has been not provided, but has not been provided at the time it was expected. So in order to assess this, we have estimated the port occurrency. So in there, we have been more technically specific. We have looked at the port rotations and if the ports in that rotation have been called, the times that were being scheduled to be called, and what that means in terms of capacity, because one element important to underline here is that you might have that 5 vessels have skipped the call, but it's important also to put in context how big these vessels are and how much that means in terms of capacity they deployed. So this to complement on assessing the services and the performances of the services.
Thanks very much indeed, Antonella. I hope that also responds to Paul Hesbeck's question about the data points used to describe schedule reliability, as he's talking about the snowball effect. If a ship leaves late from one port terminal, that it would have a snowball effect on other services. A slightly different, an interesting question from Jan Franke. Do you have examples of markets where competition monitoring is better than the examples in the report?
Well, in the report, I think we have given several examples of what some countries are doing. I think what is important to notice is that several countries are now actually reviewing what is going on in the container shipping market. Or have finalized investigations in it. So that is, for example, the case in Australia, and in the US, in South Korea, etc. Then it is clear that there are differences between different jurisdictions when it comes to monitoring competition. One example that we give where we look a little bit more in detail is the case of the US, or the Federal Maritime Commission. That is already, let's say, a dedicated body that is there to look into this, and where it is also necessary to file all the different agreements between shipping companies, so the vessel sharing agreements for the consortia and the alliances, with the Federal Maritime Commission, and there's also a more regular information exchange going on there. So you can contrast that with the situation in other parts of the world where there is certainly much less information available on what's going on in the market, and less monitoring of the market. So these are some of the examples that we put in there.
Thanks indeed, Olaf. And needless to say, we have questions relating to the environmental aspects of shipping. Eddie van Bovel refers to the upcoming climate regulations for shipping that will add a cost to shipping operators. And he takes the example of Maersk having already announced that they would add a separate surcharge to cover the cost of emission allowances when they kick in. Do you expect that liners will reassign vessels to have their most efficient vessels serving Europe to minimize costs there? And could this add to logistics complexity?
Antonella, do you want to take that question? Or?
Yeah, you start and I'll complement if you like, Olaf.
Okay. So the question is, are the most efficient vessels going to be put on the Asia-Europe route? In a way, that is, I think, already the case. So you see that let's say the largest vessels with the largest capacity are already deployed there. Of course, what we have seen, what we also put in the report is that that we've seen that part of that capacity has been transferred to other routes, in particular also the Transpacific routes. So that is something that is going on. But generally, of course, there is an interest for carriers also to put, let's say, the largest vessels on the routes where most of the cargo is, and that means also that somehow there should be a balance when it comes to, well, the most efficient ships and the cargo flows. Indeed, that let's say if there's going to be new climate regulations related to shipping, that will have an impact on price. That is also the idea. I think that it should have an impact on the price. So we also expect that if that would be a case, that this could lead to a higher price. We've seen that with the introduction of the sulfur regulation a few years ago. And it's also logical to expect that now. At the same time, there's a lot of things going on, of course, at the same time. So it's not only going to be a surcharge, there's also going to be other developments that is going to maybe go in the other direction, or maybe going to enhance that. We have indeed seen the very recent announcement of Maersk on what could be possible impact on price. I think it's interesting also to notice that actually the price development has taken place over the last 2 years are of a much higher order than, let's say, the surcharges that they foresee that would be necessary to comply with some of the climate change regulations. But in any case, that is something that is moving, and that might, of course, change. And of course, a lot will depend also on how stringent some of the regulation, upcoming regulation or carbon price will be.
Thanks indeed, Olaf. A question from Clara Salarich referring to the EU's consortia block exemption regulation, on which ITF has done extensive work in the past. Clara asks that should we expect a more detailed assessment from the European Commission for the upcoming review in 2024?
I think that the European Commission has announced that they will start their review of that consortia block exemption regulation this year. So I think that is to be expected. I think our report can play a role there in the sense that it provides a lot of different data points. Then, of course, the whole question of what is going to be the exact scope of that evaluation and what are the different data that they will use for that is, of course, not really for us to answer. That is something that the Commission will decide. But in any case, I think it's important to know that I mean, there are a lot of data already in this report. Also, a lot of data available in the different quarterly reports that MDS Transmodal has made, and of course, Antonella can talk more about that. And then, of course, there's a whole database with a lot of different elements that could be relevant for that evaluation. And maybe Antonella, you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, well, I think to complete the list of tools available now that maybe were not available or not to this extent last time around, when the consortia block exemption regulation was under scrutiny, is the alternative indicators that Olaf and I are suggesting. This is not to say they are perfect, but they are alternative way of assessing competition that competition might like to consider.
Thanks very much. Coming to the issue of users paying for the infrastructure costs of shipping, Niels asks, won't the lines simply pass this on to the shippers as a new fee?
Maybe, but the question, of course, is who should actually pay for that infrastructure? And at this moment, it appears to be that a lot of it is actually financed by taxpayers. our recommendation is that, well, the users of that infrastructure would actually need to pay more. And of course, if that is going to be passed on to customers, that would mean that the price of traded goods would be a bit more. But that would also be fair, because this is of course what is the price actually of these goods.
Okay, coming back to we've got a few more minutes left, so if you want to send a question, please do so now in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions. Many of you have put in statements into our Q&A chat, so we're trying to answer actual questions as best as we can. Following the webinar, we'll try to get back and provide data points as requested for the issue of port congestion, etc. We will get back to you bilaterally about that. Olaf, back to from the EU point of view, Kurt Rydamger asks if it's acceptable that the lines are de facto bringing chaos to European supply chains by moving capacity to the better paying trade lanes, i.e. Far East, USA. That means increasing costs for European companies and consumers, although Europe has, as you mentioned, effective ports and terminals. How do you think the EU can counteract that effect?
You're right. This is a point that we make in the report, indeed, showing that, well, that there are problems in certain parts of the world that now have spilled over to other parts, including in Europe. So European shippers are right to wonder why they are actually paying for port congestion in the US, why they are paying for more demand in the US. And I think part of the answer is in the fact that first, this has become a really global industry with global networks. So a lot of the capacity can be moved very quickly from one trade lane to another. And that is, in a way, something that a lot of regulators, also the European ones, have stimulated. And the second one is related to the fact that a lot of the repositioning, but also the capacity management of shipping companies has actually been facilitated by regulation, including also European regulation. So what can the European regulator do? Well, certainly look at that regulation and to see if that still makes sense in the context of the current situation. And we think that what is actually warranted is some sort of a more constrained conception of capacity management by carriers. So we can see that there might be a need for them to do this, but in a less expensive way than has been deployed over the last years.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Olaf. We will wrap up the session with that. We will deal with the several statements that have come in the Q&A. Following this, we'll follow up with an email for that. So it just leaves me to thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you very much to Olaf and Antonella for an excellent report, and we look forward to seeing its impact in the coming weeks and months. So we'll follow up with an email response to all of you who've participated today with links to downloads to ancillary information and also ways to stay in touch with the International Transport Forum. Thank you all very much indeed.